Just say Clark just got put under the microscope again, and her response says everything. Caitlin Clark doesn't need a bad game to become the biggest story in the WNBA. Sometimes, all it takes is one missed opportunity, one controversial moment, or one question from a reporter, and suddenly the entire basketball world is talking about her again. But right now, Clark is entering one of the most interesting stretches of her 2026 season. Just one night ago, the Indiana Fever were sitting on what looked like a game they had completely under control against the Las Vegas Aces. They built a 20-point advantage, appeared ready to close out one of the league's biggest teams, and then watched everything disappear in a matter of minutes. The Aces stormed back, the game went to overtime, and in the final moments, Caitlin Clark found herself at the center of the biggest mistakes. She missed two crucial free throws late in regulation, committed a costly turnover in overtime, and watched Chelsea Gray hit another unbelievable shot to finish the Fever's comeback attempt. Clark finished with 20 points and 8 assists, but the numbers don't tell the real story. What happened after the game is what makes this story worth watching, because instead of pointing fingers, Clark immediately put the responsibility on herself. She essentially said that the mistakes were hers to own and that this simply couldn't happen. That kind of response tells you something about where Clark is mentally right now. And that's important because Indiana doesn't have time to sit around feeling sorry for itself. The Fever are right in the middle of a playoff race, and today they turn around and face the Chicago Sky at the United Center. The game is already one of the most talked about matchups of the weekend because Caitlin Clark and the Fever are coming off one of the most painful losses of their season, while Chicago has an opportunity to take advantage of a team that could still be emotionally recovering. The Sky entered the matchup at 12-19, while Indiana comes in at 19-12, meaning the Fever have a significantly stronger record, but the WNBA has shown all season that records don't guarantee anything once the ball goes up. The game is scheduled for August 8 at 3:33 p.m. at Eastern, and the stakes are much bigger than another regular season matchup. Indiana needs to prove that the collapse against Las Vegas was an isolated failure rather than a sign of a deeper problem. What makes the Las Vegas loss especially frustrating is that Indiana actually did so much right. The Fever went on a huge 24-4 run in the second quarter and built a lead of 20 points. For long stretches, they looked like the better team. Their defense created opportunities, their offense was moving, and Clark was helping them maintain control. But then the Aces changed the game completely. Las Vegas responded with a massive 40-11 run, and suddenly the advantage that had looked almost impossible to lose was gone. That is the kind of collapse that stays in a team's head. You can survive a close loss. You can accept getting beaten by a better team. But blowing a 20-point lead against one of the WNBA's best teams creates questions about execution, composure, and decision-making when the pressure becomes unbearable. Clark's late mistakes became the easiest part of the story to focus on. But Indiana's head coach Stephanie White made it clear that the defeat wasn't the responsibility of one player. The Fever committed 21 turnovers, struggled to shoot efficiently in the second half, and allowed Las Vegas to collect 12 offensive rebounds. In other words, this was a team collapse, even though Clark's mistakes happened to come at the most visible moments. And this is where Caitlin Clark's response becomes more interesting than the mistakes themselves. Superstars are constantly expected to take responsibility, but there is a difference between taking accountability and carrying the entire burden of a team loss. Clark chose accountability. She didn't pretend the missed free throws didn't matter. She didn't act like the overtime turnover was irrelevant. She acknowledged the moments where she could have helped Indiana close the game, but at the same time her coach defended her, pointing toward the bigger picture. That distinction matters because the Fever are trying to build a team that can win together. If every loss becomes Caitlin Clark failed, then Indiana will never develop the mentality required to survive a playoff series. Great teams don't depend on one player being perfect. They depend on everyone being reliable when the game gets difficult. There is another reason Clark is under an unusually bright spotlight right now. The basketball questions aren't the only questions she is being asked. Over the last week, Clark has repeatedly been pulled into conversations surrounding teammate Sophie Cunningham and the wider debate about transgender athletes in women's sports. Cunningham's comments created controversy around the Fever. Protests appeared around games, and the issue quickly moved beyond basketball. Reporters naturally turned to Clark because of her status as the league's most recognizable young star. But Clark's response has been remarkably consistent. She doesn't want to make the issue about herself, and she believes leagues and governing bodies should be responsible for establishing the rules. She has also emphasized that she wants to focus on basketball. That answer might sound simple, but in today's sports environment, staying out of a controversy can sometimes become a controversy of its own. Every sentence a superstar says gets analyzed. Every sentence she doesn't say gets analyzed too. Clark understands that reality. She knows that if she gives a strong personal opinion, it will instantly become a national headline. If she refuses to comment, people will ask why. And if she says that governing bodies should make the rules, another group will debate whether that response is enough. There is almost no way for someone with her level of visibility to completely escape the conversation. That's why her decision to repeatedly redirect the focus toward basketball is significant. She isn't pretending the controversy doesn't exist. She's simply making it clear that she doesn't believe every public issue needs to become her personal battle. And that brings us back to the basketball court. Because tonight's story is ultimately about whether Clark can respond to adversity the way great players are expected to respond. The easiest thing after a loss like Las Vegas would be to play cautiously. A player who has just been criticized for missing crucial free throws might start second-guessing every decision. A player who turned the ball over in overtime might become afraid to take risks. But Clark's game has never been built around playing scared. Her biggest strength has always been her willingness to attempt the difficult pass, take the deep three, push the pace, and trust her basketball instincts. If she allows one painful finish to change that identity, then the loss becomes more damaging than it needs to be. If she responds by playing with the same aggression and confidence, then the Vegas game becomes something completely different, a lesson. That's exactly what Indiana needs from her against Chicago. Not perfection, not a 40-point performance, not some ridiculous statistical explosion designed to silence every critic on social media. They simply need Caitlin Clark to play her game. The Fever need her to control the offense, make the right reads, take open shots without hesitation, and trust the teammates around her. They also need the rest of the roster to do its part. Kelsey Mitchell has been one of Indiana's most important scoring threats, and came into the Chicago matchup averaging 28.1 points over her previous 10 games according to the Associated Press preview. Aaliyah Boston remains a critical piece inside, and the Fever's overall depth has to prevent Clark from carrying every possession. The Chicago matchup also brings its own layer of intrigue because of the history between these franchises and the attention surrounding Clark whenever she plays in Chicago. The Sky have their own young talent and have been playing much better over stretches of the season than their overall record might suggest. Chicago entered the game 12-19, but had gone 5-5 over its previous 10, averaging 92.8 points per game during that stretch. That's enough to make Indiana uncomfortable if the Fever don't bring the same intensity they showed during their best moments against Las Vegas. And then, there's the bigger picture. Clark is now in her third WNBA season, and the conversation around her has evolved dramatically. During her rookie year, the question was whether she could survive the physicality and speed of professional basketball. Then the question became whether she could turn individual brilliance into team success. Now, the question is much bigger. Can Caitlin Clark become the centerpiece of a team that genuinely competes for championships? The Fever's 19-12 record coming into today's game suggests they're already in the playoff conversation. But playoff basketball exposes weaknesses that regular season basketball can sometimes hide. Turnovers matter more. Missed free throws matter more. Defensive rebounds matter more. And every late-game possession becomes magnified. That is why the loss to Las Vegas could actually become useful for Indiana. It exposed exactly what the Fever need to improve before the postseason. They can't allow a 20-point lead to disappear. They can't give elite opponents extra possessions through offensive rebounds and turnovers. And they can't expect Caitlin Clark to rescue them every time the game gets chaotic. If Indiana fixes those problems now, the pain of the Aces' loss could eventually become one of the most valuable lessons of their season. But for Clark personally, there is an even bigger test. Can she separate accountability from self-blame? Those are two completely different things. Accountability says, I made mistakes and I need to improve. Self-blame says, everything went wrong because of me. The first creates growth. The second creates pressure that can become destructive. Based on her post-game comments and her coach's defense of her, Clark appears to understand the difference. She acknowledged what she could have done better while still moving forward. That's exactly the mentality a franchise player needs during a long season. And that's why today's game against Chicago is so fascinating. If Clark comes out aggressive and Indiana controls the game, the narrative will immediately shift toward resilience. If the Fever struggle again, people will start asking whether the collapse against Las Vegas revealed something more serious. That's the reality of playing in the biggest spotlight in the WNBA. One game can change the conversation. One quarter can change the narrative. One possession can become a clip that gets replayed for days. Caitlin Clark knows that better than almost anyone. She also knows that the best response isn't always something you say. Sometimes it's what you do next. After the heartbreak against Las Vegas, Clark doesn't have the luxury of spending days thinking about what went wrong. The schedule moves forward. Chicago is waiting. The playoff race is getting tighter. And every game from this point forward is another opportunity to show what kind of team Indiana really is. The Fever have already demonstrated that they can score with anyone. They've shown they can build huge leads. They've shown they can put together explosive offensive stretches and compete with elite opponents. What they haven't completely proven yet is whether they can consistently close those games when everything is on the line. That's the next step. And for Caitlin Clark, that next step is going to be watched more closely than anything she's done this season. Because that's what happens when you're Caitlin Clark. People don't just watch the points. They watch the response. They watch the pressure. They watch what happens after the mistake. And right now, the most important part of this story isn't the 2 missed free throws in Las Vegas. It isn't the turnover in overtime. It isn't even the 20-point lead that disappeared. It's what Caitlin Clark does next. If she responds with confidence, Indiana could turn a heartbreaking loss into momentum. If the Fever learn from their mistakes and stop giving away possessions, they could enter the final stretch of the season as a much more dangerous playoff team. And if Clark continues developing the ability to balance scoring, playmaking, leadership, and accountability, then this season could become another major step in the evolution of one of the most influential players the WNBA has ever seen. So now the question is simple. Can Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever bounce back immediately? Can they turn the frustration of Las Vegas into fuel against Chicago? And most importantly, when the next close game arrives, will Indiana be ready to finish what it starts? That's the story to watch. Because Caitlin Clark doesn't need to erase the Vegas loss. She needs to learn from it. And if she does, the next chapter could be much more interesting than the one that just ended.